Okay, tonight we are going to be looking at what is an argument in defense of the reliability of the Gospels. Last time I did one of these, we talked about the genuineness of the Gospels. Are they actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Right, and we show that yes, they are. Historical tradition, church tradition, everything points to them actually being written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Critics want to say that they were written about 100 years later by anonymous people and the names were assigned to them, but we saw that no, in fact, it is the more reasonable conclusion that they were actually written by the authors who bear their names. Now, that's a whole different question to whether or not they can be believed, right? Because you could say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them, and they were lying, or they didn't know what they were talking about, right? And so that's a whole other question. And we're going to defend that one tonight by looking at the way they interlock and go together. That there is what historians would call this kind of mark of authenticity, that they just look like they are reliable. For full disclosure, you might notice there on your notes that there's a title. There we go. Internal evidence for the truth of the Gospels and Acts. I am not Dr. Timothy McGrew. He is actually quite a nice guy. I've met him a little bit online. And we are not at St. Michael Lutheran Church, and this is not 2012. However, I am going to borrow heavily from the talk he gave. All of his material for this is on the website where you can get the notes and the PowerPoint and everything. But I want to make sure that I give credit because, I mean, the work he has done on this, I'm just taking what he did, slightly repackaging it to give it to you, but he deserves full credit. However, a title like that is not really me, so I had to rename it. How the Gospels fit together, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're just talking about how these go together like the pieces of a puzzle. So just to give you a little bit of a motto, little verse here, 2 Peter 1:16. And I love this because people like to say that the New Testament, the Gospels especially, they're legends, they're myths, they were written later on, and they were things that are just made up. There's a movement out there among non-believers that say, it's called mythicism. They say Jesus is a myth, totally made up, never even existed. Even if there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth, he was so far removed from what we have in the Bible that it's not even the same person. So they have this idea. But Peter specifically says in 2 Peter, we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Okay, the claim is from the writers of the New Testament is that this stuff actually happened. And so, who wrote the Gospels? We already talked about that. Difference between authenticity and genuineness, right? We saw they're genuine. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them. There is external evidence that indicates they're reliable. That might be a good talk for another time. I wanted to look at the internal. So here's two questions. Why are there 4 Gospels? You ever thought about that? Why 4? Why not 1? Why are you going to have all these different writings? You just have one and tell the story and be done with it, right? Why are there 4? Hopefully, you'll see why that is as we go along. And can we tell by comparing the two that they are indeed authentic, that they are indeed reliable? Right? If we take 2 passages and we compare them, we can say, okay, well, these match up. Now, if they match up, and you see 2 things that say this, that they kind of corroborate, right? You have 2 sources, they tell you the same story, your first thought is going to be, of course. See, there you go. You have 2 witnesses telling the same story. However, let's kind of let our inner skeptic out a little bit. Is it possible that they copied? If you're to take any kind of New Testament course, you're going to learn about what's called the synoptic problem. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels. They all basically take the same view of the life of Jesus. And in fact, there's a lot of things that they have that are almost word for word. Any teachers? in here today? I'm trying to remember who's been a teacher before, right? Well, let's imagine you are a teacher, and you have two students who turn in papers that are almost worded identically. What are you going to think? They copied, right? One of them copied off the other, or maybe they both copied from some other paper, right? And so whenever you see things that appear to be like almost verbatim, you're going to think, okay, somebody's copying. There's something crazy going on here, right? So how can we rule this out? How can we rule out the idea that they were copied? Because that's the whole synoptic problem. There's some things that look like they were copied. And so scholars are trying to figure out who wrote first. Did Mark write first, or did Matthew write first? Who copied off of who? And did Luke copy off of Matthew or Mark, or maybe both? And so I've heard it presented before. And this is kind of where this comes in and like challenges against the faith. Because you might have someone say, well, we have 4 different independent eyewitness testimonies about Christ. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And someone says, no, you don't have 4, you have 1, because they all copied from each other. Well, okay, now that makes a little bit of a difference, right? You don't have 4, you have 1. And so, can we resolve this? I hope you understand that my view is yes, we can. It's what's called an undesigned coincidence. These are whenever you have different authors, details interlock in the text to where it doesn't make any rational sense to think they were copying off of one another, where one will have an open question and the other provides some details that answers the question. Or maybe vice versa, they fill in details for each other. And so the question is, well, if they were copying, why wouldn't they include the detail? Right? A lot of times it'll be passing details. It'll be those little trivial things that you just kind of fly right past, that don't even really register. Right? Because when we're reading our Bible, we're looking for some theological truth. Right? We're looking for some kind of spiritual enrichment. We're not looking at what town were they in. Right? Where the genealogies, does anyone actually read through those line by line when you come to the genealogies? Whether you're talking about Genesis or Matthew or Luke, do you actually read, so-and-so beget so-and-so and so-and-so beget? Do you actually read through those? Well, there's actually some information contained in those, right, that show you a big picture view of things. But there's these little details kind of just nestled in there, these little trivial things that the authors just wrote as they were writing, but whenever you compare them, they interlock together with one another. And if they were making this up, that would not be the case. Fictions and forgeries do not work this way. Okay, if you're right, if it's a forgery, if it's a fiction, if you're just making it up, why would you have these unanswered questions and loose ends? You can just write a full account where you don't leave any unanswered questions. And if you're writing something and someone else is going to come along, someone else is writing something, you can't control what they write. So the chances of I'm writing a fiction and you're writing a fiction and we both just happen to write things that fill in details, it just doesn't really work. And so this idea of this interlocking details is going to build us a case, right? We expect to find this kind of interlocking, this kind of coincidence, undesigned coincidence, if people are telling the truth. Right now on Wednesdays, we're studying with J. Warner Wallace from his book, Forensic Faith. One of the things that he says that brought him to start to wonder, oh, wow, these might actually be true. Right? As an atheist detective, he's examining the Bible, and one of the things that starts to raise the question is, for him, these actually sound like independent witnesses. Because he'll say, whenever he gets to a crime scene and there's witnesses, he wants them separated. Right? Whenever he gets the call, he calls down to the officer on the scene and says, are there witnesses? Okay, separate them. Do not let them talk to each other. Because as he interviews the witnesses, there's going to be little details that each one gives that fills out the whole story. And if he shows up and he has these witnesses and they're all saying exactly the same thing, okay, something's up. That's how he would know it's not genuine. That's how he would know that this is not reliable testimony. Somebody's lying. There's something going on here. But if they're all going to have different details, because they have different backgrounds, they have different points of view, they have different purposes in what they're telling, well, same thing with the gospel authors. And so just like witnesses are going to have variations, the gospel authors also have these variations, but yet they go together to form this fuller picture. All right? Well, let's get an example going. Let's take a look at what we got. Matthew chapter 8. And by the way, all of these, you don't have to be a Bible scholar to figure this out. Right? You don't need a degree in Bible. You don't need to be able to read Greek. All you need is your Bible and a little bit of effort to pay attention to what you're reading. Okay? Here we have Matthew chapter 8. It says, when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever and touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she arose and began to serve him. That evening, they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. Now, what's an interesting question that you might ask there if you're reading that? So he comes into Peter's house, heals his mom, mother-in-law. Word gets around, but everybody waits until evening to come be healed. Well, that's kind of strange. If you have a sick loved, if you're sick or you have a sick loved one or demon-possessed family member, you think you're just going to sit around and wait for the sun to go down before you go get them healed? Right? You get word there's a holy man over there casting out demons and healing people. Oh, okay. Well, I'll catch him after dinner. Right? No, you're going to go. So why do they wait? Why do they wait? Well, flip over to Mark chapter 1, and he tells us on the Sabbath, telling the same story. On the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And then after this done at the synagogue, he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever. And that evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed with demons. Now, the Jewish day, sundown is whenever the day is over. So if it's on the Sabbath, you can't go on the Sabbath. Right? These are very, very devout. The Jewish system they were living in under the Pharisees was very legalistic, and so you would not go to, healing would have been violating the Sabbath. Remember, Jesus gets in trouble for that. He heals on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees freak out and call him, a sinner, because you're not supposed, that would be work. And so everybody waits till sundown to take their sick, because it's like, okay, sun went down, Sabbath is over, let's go. And so Matthew doesn't tell you that. It just tells you that everybody waited, everybody came for healing in the evening. Well, why did they wait? Well, Mark actually tells you, because it was the Sabbath. And so here you have, you want to do a little chart. Right there on your cover sheet. I actually went ahead and drew that. If you have a writing pencil, you might want to, as we'll see as this goes out or continues on. But you have Mark explaining something in Matthew. So some little almost seemingly insignificant detail in Mark is explaining an open question in Matthew. Okay? So you're kind of seeing how these work and how the little details kind of fit together. Now, if you were to have one of these, right? Okay, well, that's kind of neat, right? That Mark answered something that was in Matthew, but okay, it's a coincidence. It's just sheer chance. But if you have a lot of them, what does that start to say? Right? If you're playing cards, right? We're Baptist, so it's not poker. You're playing like, I don't know, spades or something. But if you're playing cards and someone comes up with a winning hand, and then another, and then another, and then another, at what point do you stop and say, hold on, something's going on here? You keep winning. You keep having all the best hands, right? Let me see up your sleeves, right? You start to question what's going on here. Well, it's the same way. Now, if all we had was this Mark and Matthew thing, or even one or two others, okay, you might be able to chalk that up to some coincidence. But there are tons of these all through the Scripture, and it's not just in a certain direction. As we're going to see as we go through these, they crisscross all through the Gospels. And so, any thoughts or questions on that? Is it kind of seeing how these will work together? Right, the Gospels answering questions in one another. Luke chapter 9. Okay, this is the story of the transfiguration. Right? Jesus goes up on the mountain with a select few disciples. They fall asleep and they wake up and they see Jesus standing there with Moses and Elijah. Right? And then he's like glowing. They just see this. It's like there he is in all his glory before them. And then it says in verse 36, they kept silent and they told no one in those days anything that they had seen. Okay, so the disciples are up on the mountain with Jesus. They see him talking with two of the greatest figures of the Old Testament who like come back from the dead, standing there talking to him, and he has this whole glowing thing going on. They just don't tell anybody. That makes sense to anybody? Right? If you saw that, think you're going to go tell somebody? Think you're going to spread the word a little bit? You'll never believe what happened on the mountain with Jesus. But they don't tell anybody. Well, that's kind of odd. Okay, well, that's Luke chapter 9. If you flip on over to Mark chapter 9, he's telling the same story. And Mark says, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. There we have Mark filling in Luke. Mark gives us the command, but he doesn't say whether or not they obeyed it. Right? But Luke tells us that they obeyed it, but he doesn't describe the command. So here we have Mark answering a question raised by Luke. So there's a gap in Luke, and Mark fills it in. Kind of combine two here. Mark chapter 6. Right, this is kind of setting up for the feeding of the 5,000. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." All right, so, and then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. All right, so we got two kind of things here that might raise some questions. All right, so there's these crowds gathering around him, and he says, hey guys, let's come off over here out of the way, right? Because there's a lot of people coming and going. Why are there so many people coming and going? Why are the roads so busy? We don't know. We don't know. Mark doesn't tell us. And then he says, come over here and sit on the green grass. Have any of y'all actually been to Israel? You ever visited the Holy Land? Yeah? Is there a lot of green grass in the Holy Land?
Around the Galilee.
Yeah. So from what I've seen, and here's a picture, actually, from what I have been told and seen, a lot of it looks kind of like that.
Yeah, most of it looks like that, but around the Sea of Galilee, there's some...
This is, I'm not sure, the feet of the 5,000 wasn't around the sea. I don't believe it was off a little somewhere else, but there's, he says, let's go sit on the green grass because there's all these people coming and going. Okay, well, green grass, when is there green grass in Israel, and why are all these people coming and going? Well, if you flip over to John chapter 6, John tells us in this same setup for the feeding of the 5,000 that the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Now, the time immediately prior to and after the Passover is growing season. This is the little window of the year that the grass is green. And because it is the major feast of the Jews, everybody's coming and going to Jerusalem. You want to know why there's so much traffic that Jesus has to tell the crowds following him, hey, let's get off the road. Let's go sit down in the green grass, is because it's Passover. Now, Mark doesn't mention that. However, John fills in those gaps. And so here we have John answering questions raised by Mark. Right? So you're kind of seeing that there's not a kind of a single flow of progression. Some scholars will have us believe that Mark wrote first and then Matthew copied him and then Luke copied him. Well, this is all kind of where we're going to see that this ends up kind of crisscrossing across all of them. Right? Any thoughts or questions about what we've covered so far? Because we're just going to keep on rolling. Got a few more of these. Matthew 14 says, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus. And he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. All right, so here's the setting. John the Baptist has been beheaded. Right? Herod, remember the story? It's kind of a gross story because his niece does this way too sexual dance, and he likes it and promises her whatever she wants, and she goes to her mom and says, "Hey mom, what should I ask for?" And mom says, "Tell him you want the head of John the Baptist." So he has John the Baptist executed to please the stripper. And so now he's freaking out because Jesus and his disciples their miracles are being performed. They're down by the river baptizing people. Jesus didn't baptize them, his disciples are. And so you have Herod who's kind of panicking. Oh no, because they're baptizing people and they're working in power. It's John the Baptist come back from the dead, right? He's kind of freaking out. Now here's interesting. Stop and think about this. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of the Jews, and he said to his servants, how does Matthew know what Herod is saying in the privacy of his own castle to his own servants? That's kind of strange. And that's one of those things that skeptics will point at. Be like, well, how does he know? He doesn't know. He's just making it all up. It's a work of fiction, right? Well, actually, there is a possible explanation in Luke. Luke is giving us a list of the people who were with Jesus and some of the women who are caring for Jesus and the disciples. And he mentions Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna and many others who provided for them out of their means. And so among the group that is with Jesus is the wife of Herod's chief servant. So gee, I wonder how Matthew might have known what was going on in Herod's household. All right, so we have now Luke explaining some answers that are left open in Matthew. All right, moving right along. Matthew chapter 11. Jesus pronouncing some woes. Everybody likes to talk about Jesus being all about love and mercy and grace and forgiveness, but there was a little bit of judgment in there as well. But he says, woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. What mighty works were done in Bethsaida? We don't know. Matthew doesn't tell us. Nowhere in Matthew do you find a record of a mighty work being done in Bethsaida. Okay? Now we're going to pause on that. Just kind of set that aside for a minute. We're going to invent a gospel story. Right? That's what they say happened. The authors of the Bible, they just made this stuff up, right? So we're going to make up a gospel story. And the setup for this story, it's going to be a miracle involving money and food. Okay, Jesus is about to do something big involving money and food. So we're going to make this up. Which disciple is he going to call on? If he's going to do something involving money and food, who do you think he's calling on? This is the interactive portion of tonight's program. Judas had the money, right? He carried the purse. So, hey, there's going to be some food going on. We need some money going on. Judas, bring me the purse, right? Who else? Maybe we want our story to have some clout to it, right? Who might you name?
Peter was a fisherman.
Peter? Hey, a fisherman. Peter, give me some fish, right? Any other ideas who we might turn to? Peter or Judas? Hey, those are two good ones. Plus, I mean, Peter, he's Peter. You're going to have something big going on. You want Jesus, your right-hand man, front and center, right? Well, we actually have in John chapter 6, Jesus, about to perform a miracle involving food, says, seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? Philip? Who's Philip? Just out of curiosity. Maybe you're paying attention this morning. Who's Philip?
Oh, he's from Bethsaida.
He is from Bethsaida. Kind of jumping ahead, right? But you wouldn't know that from this. There's nothing in this passage. There's nothing in Matthew that tells you this, right? But Philip? Why is he calling on Philip? Well, if you go to Luke chapter 9, kind of the account of the same thing, it says, on their return, the apostles told him that they had done. And he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. And when the crowds learned it, they followed him. Okay, so they're in Bethsaida. So we're seeing what mighty work was done in Bethsaida. The feeding of the 5,000. So there we have Luke answering that. But then we also have this. Why does he call on Philip? In John 12 it says, so these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida and Galilee. Right? And we also saw in John chapter 1 that Philip is from Bethsaida. So here they are, they're in Bethsaida, they have this large group of people, and so he's like, hey Philip, you're from here, right? Where's the Piggly Wiggly? Right? Where's the H-E-B? Do you know where the Walmart is? We need to feed some people, right? So why is he calling Philip? It's in Philip's hometown. So that's the guy you're going to call on. And so we see this interlocking going on between John and Luke. Luke does not mention Philip, and John doesn't mention Bethsaida. And only by putting them together, we understand this whole story about why he calls on Philip. And we also get the answer to the mighty work. Whenever he is saying, woe to you, Bethsaida. Or woe to you, if the mighty work done in you, right? And so we get this answer from multiple passages. That if you have to pull them together to get those interlocking details. Okay? Now, one thing that's interesting, Matthew does mention the feeding of the 5,000, but he mentions it after the woes. Right, so he actually mentions the feeding happens in Bethsaida, but he mentions that after he mentions the woes. So as you're reading, you come to the part that says, woe to you. Because Matthew, this is another good point to remember about the gospel authors. They had a different point of view about how you write things. We, in our modern post-enlightenment time, we want facts, we want details, we want accuracy. We want it to go in order and line up the way it happened. That's not how they wrote necessarily. Matthew is very thematic. He has a point he wants to make, and he plays loose with rearranging events to put them where he wants them to get the point across he wants to get across. Right? And we see the same thing in John. Luke is the only one who actually says, I set out to write a chronological, orderly account. But we know that Luke's intention was to write out the events as they happened. But the other three didn't do that. So we compare them, and we end up getting even more. All right, so if you want to fill out if you're keeping that, seeing how the little interlocking network is going, you want to fill that out there. We had Luke answering some things in John. We got a few more, just a few more. Let's keep on rolling. In Mark 14, they make an accusation of Jesus, and then later they're hurling insults at him on the cross. And they say this. They say, we heard him say that he will destroy this temple that was made with hands, and in 3 days build another. And then while he's on the cross, those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Nothing in Mark or Matthew or Luke tell you anything about why they would think Jesus was threatening to destroy the temple. It's not found anywhere in Mark or any of the other synoptics. Whenever they say, we heard him say that I will destroy this temple, it's not recorded anywhere in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So where do they get this idea that he said he was going to destroy the temple? Well, we jump on over to John chapter 2. And the Jews said to him, what sign will you show us for doing these things? And Jesus answered, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So he gives the statement, and they may have kind of twisted that in their angry thinking to see that he was threatening to destroy the temple, right? So John gives us this statement, but John does not record the accusation. In John's gospel, they never make the accusation about this. But he records the comment And so neither of this was possible to be copied from the other. Okay, here we have another issue of Mark, or of John answering a question found in Mark. But do you see this? There's no way that Mark could have copied from John or John copied from Mark. They both have completely just left out detail that you would want to include if you were copying from the other. Okay, this one's kind of fun. This is one I actually hadn't caught before. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Okay, this is post-resurrection. It's a familiar story because Jesus is about to ask him 3 times, "Simon, Peter, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." "Peter, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." "Peter, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you're right." Why does he ask him 3 times? Well, because he betrayed him 3 times. So it's kind of this kind of reinstating of Peter. But what's interesting is, the first time he asks, he says, "Peter, do you love me more than these? More than the other disciples? Do you love me more than they do?" Why would Jesus ask him, "Do you love me more than they do?" John doesn't actually tell us. And it's kind of a head scratcher. It's like, that just seems kind of a weird question for Jesus to ask, right? More than, I mean, sure, ask, do you love me, but do you love me more than they do? Well, the explanation is found in Matthew 26. This is at the Last Supper, right? Whenever Jesus is saying, I'm going to be arrested, and say, no, Lord, no, we won't let it happen. And Jesus says, "No, this night." And Peter was like, "No, they may all fall away from you, but I will not." Right? Peter answers, "Though they all fall away, I will never fall away." Of course, then he goes and denies him 3 times. But look what he did. They're at the Last Supper. He stands up and he tells Jesus, "I will stand by you." What's he saying? Even if they all fall away, I love you more than they do, is what he's saying. And so here we have, Matthew records this interchange in the Last Supper. John does not record this comment, right? But he records Jesus' statement. So here we have Peter boasting that he was the most faithful and loved Jesus more than anyone else. Of course, then he disobeys. And so then Jesus asks him, "Do you love me more than everyone else?" And so here we have Matthew explaining John. Kind of seeing this, it doesn't matter where you start. This idea that they copied from one another, that they're answering questions found in one another. Okay. This one's kind of fun too. Luke 23, this is Jesus on trial. Jesus on trial. It says, "They began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar,'" which is kind of funny because he didn't. Well, what happened? They brought him the coin. "Hey, should we pay taxes?" He didn't tell them not to pay taxes. He told them to pay their taxes. So they're lying right there. But anyway, "He forbid us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And he answered and said to him, 'You have said so.' And Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, 'I find no guilt in this man.'" Okay, now stop and think about the sequence of these events. Look at what just happened. Okay, they make this accusation. Right? Well, what is the actual reason they want Jesus put to death? Because he's claiming to be the Christ? They want him put to death for blasphemy. Right? The charge they make against him when he is on trial before the Sanhedrin, the charge is blasphemy. Pilate doesn't care about blasphemy. He's not a Jew. What does he care if someone's blaspheming the Jewish God? Right? So they come to him and they give this charge that he says he's a king. Okay, well now you have a problem. Because that's Caesar's territory. Only Caesar gets to appoint kings. He's stepping up claiming to be a king. That's rebellion. Now that's a Roman problem. Okay, so he asked Jesus about this accusation, and Jesus admits it. Okay, the phrase that Jesus says, "You have said so." That's a little bit of a play on words, a little bit of a phraseology in the Greek that kind of means something like, it is as you say, or, well, that's what you've said, right? But in no interpretation is it a denial, right? Nothing. There is no way to interpret that phrase where Jesus is denying the charge. He's admitting his guilt. And then Pilate comes out and says, he's innocent. Wait a minute. How did that conversation just go? Replay that. Hey, he says he's a king. Are you a king? Yes, I am. Okay, he's innocent. Wait a minute. He just pled guilty. How is he innocent? All right. Well, that's Luke. John actually gives us a bit more of the conversation. By the way, this is another technique that was used in ancient writing called compression, where they would just kind of take some of the key points and hit those and leave out all the other detail, and they would compress a story down to its main points. And so that's the way they would tell a story. It's actually quite common in the ancient world. So now we have John. Pilate enters his headquarters again, and he calls Jesus to him, and he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And there's another conversation, but Jesus tells him, "My kingdom is not of this world." And so Pilate then goes back outside and tells the Jews, "I find no guilt in him." Oh, okay. That makes a little more sense. Right? Are you a king? Yes, I am. But my kingdom's not of this world. Right? I'm not here to threaten you. I'm no threat to Caesar. I'm not trying to set up a kingdom on earth. Right? Oh, it's a spiritual thing. Right? It's a religious thing. Okay, you're not really a king. Yeah, he's innocent. And so John kind of fills in the gaps there that Luke left out. Okay? So in John's account, the question kind of seems to come out of nowhere. Luke gives the accusation, but not the full answer. John gives the full answer, but not the accusation. And so you can kind of see here again where we have some additional interlocking, some additional support can add there to our example. One more, and it's actually kind of fun because in the course of Jesus' interrogation with Pilate, right, he says, my kingdom's a spiritual kingdom. My kingdom is not of this world. Otherwise, my disciples would fight. Well, there is one little problem with that account in John. Because John 18:10 tells us that Peter actually did fight. Right, remember the story? They come to arrest Jesus. Peter draws his sword and chops off a guy's ear, which means he's either really good with a sword or really bad. Okay, so he chops off this guy's ear. And that's all John tells you about it. Okay? Now, Jesus is before Pilate and says, if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting. Yeah. Newsflash, Jesus, your servants were fighting. Peter cut off a guy's ear, right? Wouldn't that qualify? So what's going on? I mean, because Jesus is saying, hey, my servants aren't going to fight. But in the garden, Jesus chopped off some guy's ear. Well, but if you go to Luke, that same event in the garden, Peter draws the sword, chops off the guy's ear, and Jesus says, no more of this. Peter, put away your sword. And he heals the guy's ear. Right? There's no evidence that any attack happened. There might be a guard that says, yeah, one of their guys had a sword. That's about it. There's no fight going on. There's no casualties. There's no battle. There's no struggle between Jesus's people and the guards. Right? Peter wasn't about to get arrested. There wasn't anything that happened there. Right? If anything, Jesus probably just made a convert out of the priest's servant by healing his ear. And so here we have Luke giving the answer to something that is lacking in John. And so you see how, and it crisscrosses from all the Gospels. There's no just kind of progression to where they're answering the book that came before them. All of them, right? Matthew answers stuff in John, and John answers stuff in Mark, and Mark answers stuff in Luke, and Luke answers stuff in Mark. And just back and forth, all of them. And these 12 examples that I've given you, these are like the tip, tippy tip top of the iceberg, right? You know how an iceberg is, what you see on top is like maybe 10% of the whole mass, and you have all this other underneath. Well, this ain't even all of the top, right? I mean, this is just, I think I heard someone explain, it's like a few snowflakes on the top of the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there are dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of these examples. If you would like to learn more, Dr. McGrew has this website called the Library of Historical Apologetics. It's there in your notes. And one thing that is not in your notes is this work by Lydia McGrew, Tim McGrew's wife, actually, called Hidden in Plain View. I have it on Kindle. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but it's just packed full of these things. And there are many, many more that she doesn't include. It has there in your notes a couple of guys that you might want to, if you're interested in this stuff, to check into. At least maybe it's in your notes. Maybe it's not in your notes. Okay, I lied to you. I'm sorry. But yeah, there we go. Edmund Bennett and John James Blunt are two historian theologian guys in the past who, this is centuries old. Okay, this isn't something that Dr. McGrew just dug up and was just like, wow, why has no one ever seen this? Well, they have seen it. It's been common knowledge for centuries. It's just not stuff that's really pursued by mainstream biblical scholars, because mainstream biblical scholarship says it's all fake and made up. So they don't want to hear these things. But it's out there. And so you just see this interweaving of details among the Gospels that is to such a degree that it's nonsensical, right? That it makes no sense. It almost seems irrational to think that they were just made up or just copied each other. They obviously, even if there was some copying that went on, right? Luke straight out tells us that he used other sources, right? He wasn't an eyewitness. He was a companion of Paul. And so he took it upon himself to study these things, interview eyewitnesses, and he used other sources. So even if he used Matthew or Mark as a source, he had other information too, right? And so this idea that, oh, well, you can't trust the Gospels, they're all made up or copied off each other anyway. No. Now, this shows that they are not only genuine, written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they are also authentic. That they were writing down what they wrote down. That what they wrote down is what they saw. They are recording events as they happened. That this is what historians call the ring of authenticity. That it just sounds true, right? And any other issue of historical work, and this would be verifiable. But because it's the Bible, no, that doesn't count, right? We can't trust the Bible. That's talking crazy talk, like Jesus and forgiven sins and people rising from the dead. No. We have to throw that out. And here's the thing to notice, because some people will say that, okay, so the Gospels might have some historical facts, right? They know their towns, they know their timing, they know their historical events, they know the public figures. Okay, so historically they have some good accurate details. Their geography and their government and all that's down good. But the miracles and stuff, that's all made up. It's like a work of historical fiction. Right? Have you ever read a novel that's historical fiction? Right? Like something that's set back in the Civil War and the Revolutionary War or something. It's fiction. It didn't actually happen. Oh, but they have their details right. Well, here's the thing. Some of these interlocking deals, did you notice what some of them involved? Feeding of the 5,000? That's a miracle. That's a miraculous event. And here it's appearing to be authentic, right? Some of these have to do with actual miracles, things that you cannot remove from the narrative of Jesus. Whenever Jesus was asking him, do you love me more than these? When did that take place? After the resurrection. Jesus having a conversation that is found to be authentic after he was supposed to be dead, right? And so this information, just kind of the way these all interlock to show each other reliable, just strengthens the knowledge that the Bible is indeed trustworthy.